Good morning, friends. Hello and welcome to the EduSat Network. Our topic of discussion is part of our series on writing in India, and the specific topic is 19th century, the period of Indian Renaissance. And for this discussion, we have with us in our studio our subject expert, Dr. Anand Prakash, retired professor of English Literature, University of Delhi. He has a teaching experience of more than 4 decades. And with this introduction, we would like to welcome sir. Thank you so much, sir, for coming. And I request you to begin our today's lecture.
Thank you, Rishi, for your kind words. Today's topic, viewers, is 19th century, the period of Indian Renaissance. And Renaissance is a very important word in world history, in literature, in culture, in society. And as has been discussed earlier also, Renaissance is development in the Western world in the 14th, 15th, 16th centuries. And this word has become now quite popular to describe trends whenever development, whenever new trends are introduced in society. And even though the word has an exact sense, with the popular use of the word, certain suggestions, certain vague, associations also have come to visit this particular word. And in the Indian context, when I was framing the subject of today's discussion, I became conscious about this particular problem of Renaissance being used in the Indian context. And then I thought that perhaps 19th century can be called the period of Renaissance, when Renaissance of a kind occurred in India, and more to do is the period than the actual actors who might have taken part in the Renaissance. And of course, there are always actors behind a trend. So it became a more of a descriptive term than a definitive, clear term which talks about changes that happened in the 19th century. In the precise sense of the word. Now, as one goes back to the Renaissance original, one realizes that it was literally meant to be new learning. And the moment the word new was used, there was definitely a reference to the old, that which had become irrelevant, which was static, which blocked the process of progress, and which was better left than allowed to continue. So that new learning, and in the Western world's case, this new learning came from ancient classics, ancient writings, which belong to the beginning of the considered history that we have. And there were references to the BC in the Western world, and those works had remained hidden for a long time from human consideration. And when they emerged again, then the Western world realized that certain approaches informed the early behavior of humankind, and that those things were in fact much more encouraging and vital, more dynamic than what came to happen in the later period. So people felt inspired to look at things from a new angle, and because this new learning then spread to so to say, as the wildfire. So the whole Europe in those centuries, 14th, 15th, 16th, was swept by this trend, and people rethought everything that they had considered, till that time, of permanent value. Now, in India's case, there have been debates about the process of development in the last millennium, the first millennium, that is from first to the 100 years, and later to the 2 millennia, and it has been surmised, it has been conjectured, that in the Indian context, things have remained circular in nature. You cannot draw a line and say, well, it starts from here, the trend then goes up to this, and then it takes a new turn, and then something else happens. So the development in India's case has not been as progressing from one point to another and taking it forward and higher. It has been circular. That's what has been considered so far. The second thing is that in India's case, the progress was also deterred by certain situations. It could be feudalism of a kind that only India had, and this German thinker, the most progressive thinker, arguably, Karl Marx, he in fact gave a word to the processes in India, and he called it the Asiatic mode of production. Asiatic, non-European, which was progressive, and Asiatic was static. So Asiatic mode of production. And what Karl Marx may have meant by the word Asiatic was that, in Asia, the kinds of rulers and monarchs came, they spent much on, luxury. And the money was not pumped back into the economy as happened in Europe in the second millennium. So things didn't progress as fast, or didn't progress at all, and they remained circular. Anyway, I don't want to go into that controversy. I simply say that so far as the 19th century is concerned, some kind of new things emerged here, and that gave us the idea whether the word Renaissance could be used for the 19th century. So I would say that there is a line of demarcation between what happened till the end of the 18th century and what started happening from the beginning of the 19th century onward, and that this line of demarcation can be quite clearly drawn in the case of India, and therefore we focus upon the 19th century from the point of view of Renaissance as we understand the term in the general sense. I would start by making a few points regarding these changes, and these changes were social in nature, they were cultural in nature, and of course later as time passed they also became political. So I just quote a sentence from a fellow scholar, and this particular statement is like this: modernity meant for some an interrogation of the Indian past. Now the person is tentative. I'm talking about Mohan Ramnan, who has given this statement, and he talks about for some, so he doesn't want to commit as much, but well, let's say that modernity interrogates the past definitely. If you are modern, if you live in the present, then you have to present a kind of locus standi to what is happening today. And since today is somewhat different from the previous thing, so one has to explain both the present and the past, and obviously you have to accept the present, and then you can say that past is gone and now we have to face the new situation in a positive sense. But then modernity is not merely present. Modernity also is an outlook, and if you accept this outlook, then you have to define certain things, the other of modernity, and that other is that things which are not relevant, which are not modern, and therefore which should be accepted as belonging to the past. So modernity started interrogating the Indian past in the 19th century, even a negation of it. Now once again the statement is not very straightforward. Even a negation. Yes, it was a negation. In India in the 19th century, people started thinking of past as dead, past as moribund, past as something that would hinder the process of growth. So it was a negation also, so far as a large number of people are concerned. But on the whole, says this person, the Indo-British encounter enabled a syncretic culture to emerge, at least among the leaders of society, the Bhadralok Bengal. So see the qualifiers in the statement, at least, and for some, and even, and all these words suggest that the person is wary to commit oneself, and therefore these words are used. And obviously 19th century is a difficult, is a complex proposition, and it's perhaps difficult to take a clear position on this. But then the point that is being made here is that there was a leader of society. There were leaders of society in the 19th century, particularly in the beginning, and these, says Mohan Ramnan, were the Bhadralok in Bengal, the people who were cultured, civilized, and who were the elites, who were not necessarily the landed gentry, but the intelligentsia, that the people who believed in culture, who wanted to interpret things, who wanted to live by what is supposed to be the domain of reason. So they would use reason to understand things, and if they found that certain things were not rational, were not reasonable, were not amenable to reason, then those things had to be questioned very clearly. So Bhadraloks emerge in Bengal, the eastern part of India, in the early 19th century. And when they emerge, then things start changing. Initially, slowly, but later on they gather momentum and they become quite fast in speed. Thus we see among the progressive sections of the society, attitude of skepticism touched even with disdain or native customs, usages, rituals and religious practices. These are the old things. These are the 18th century things, that you believe in religion, you believe in customs, you believe in rituals, and the idea of ritual is that you keep repeating something uncritically all the time. So whenever there is an occasion, then you have a ritual to perform, and that ritual is not questioned. But then somebody can stand up and say, why this ritual? What has this to do with the event that we are celebrating, or the event that we are formalizing? And this kind of reasoning is not allowed by the ritualists, by those who perform the rituals or who support the rituals. Therefore, the process set in around the beginning of the 19th century, when the section called the Bhadralok in Bengal, in the eastern part of the country, that came into existence, and some people started questioning the validity of customs, which were earlier accepted as given. So modernity came, modern point of view came, and this modern point of view became a kind of threat to the culture of rituals, and a new culture had to be forged, had to be evolved, and how that could happen was not very clear to people. But one thing was certain, that modernity was the answer, and whatever opposed modernity had to be shunned. Now I would take the question or whatever perception of our able anchor, and and I would like to say whether the idea of modernity is always acceptable, or there can be some problems with it.
Sir, like you just said that it became a threat to the culture of rituals and the idea of religion and customs, which of course have been so strongly in place even today. So I'm sure that these ideas put up by the elites, by the intelligentsia, the Bhadralok, would have met with a lot of resistance by people. And I would also like to ask you, since it is we are talking about the Bhadralok as a modern elite, and people who are considered as modern and putting up the modern point of view, were they only limited to this section, of course, and that makes it a smaller section of people sort of revolting or cutting down the ideas of a large section of population. So that would have put up a huge
this is a very good point. Actually, you are right that so far as the Western world was concerned, the ideas went down to the masses, and they of course they started with the upper crust, but very soon they became popular. In the case of India, because it was just beginning from the Bhadralok onwards, therefore the process was very slow, and for a long time, for the first 20-30 years, the phenomena would be restricted to the Bhadralok themselves, the elites. So, but the important point about the Bhadralok at that point, at that time, is that Bhadralok are the people who are in direct touch with the Britishers then, and Britishers are becoming more and more powerful then, and so therefore the Britishers and the Bhadralok, they get together to form a kind of combination, and that combination will work. So whether the grassroots, whether the people at the lower rungs would understand things or not, is not important. The second thing is that apart from the Bhadralok, there are other people also who believe in customs and who are privileged. So there will be a kind of a tussle between one section of the upper crust and the other section. And Bhadralok is one important section which swears by modernity, and they are supported to a large extent by the British administration, by the Britishers then, who are scholars, who manage things, who interpret Indian reality to their advantage, and are becoming more and more powerful. So this is a valid point, that things remained largely confined to the upper 5% or even less. But then the trend started, and since customs were involved for criticism, therefore the customs which are observed by all the Indians, those customs raised the hackles, and then people would start thinking, at least thinking, if not acting according to their own views. Therefore, the process began in the early 19th century. So this is how I and thanks Urvashi for kind of explaining the point further. And then we move to the next point. We have interesting debates between secular-minded utilitarians. This is the I was coming to that actually the trend may have begun with the imagination of the Britishers in India. They also wanted to bring about certain changes, and in fact in Britain, in England, certain debates were going on, and the important debates were between the traditionalists and the utilitarians. Utilitarians, whom one can popularly call them as the bourgeois in England, who would be going by the idea of utility, usefulness. You produce more and you involve more people, and if you produce more, then you are creating wealth, and that wealth is important. And in fact, the bourgeois development is shunned by the traditionalists because Christianity, religion, customs, etc. don't bother about development. They bother about simplicity, about asceticism, about control and self-control and all those things. So utilitarians were talking about pleasure principle, they were talking about plenty, they were talking about usefulness, and the traditionalists were talking about religion, about self-control, about penance, about the divine interests of in support of the divine and all those things. So that way this debate was going on, and this debate finally also came to India in the form of the old and the new. Bourgeois in the English society was new, and the old was the permanent, that is religion, and this got translated in India in the context of the modern ideas, the new ideas, not necessarily utilitarian, new ideas and the old customs. So that way the process was further compounded by the presence of the traditionalists in India, in the British bureaucracy, and those others who talked, for instance, about science, who took cognizance of new inventions, new philosophies, etc. that people were forging in the western part of the world. So conservatives and utilitarians were two polar centers of the English presence in India. So here also in the British bureaucracy, you had utilitarians, those who wanted some kind of progress, who wanted to increase trade and commerce, who wanted to increase money, and there were others who were talking about values. So values on one side, one should be good, one should be happy, one should be contented, one should be helpful, one should be friendly. This is one kind of a paradigm, and the other paradigm is that one should produce more, one should involve more people into the process of progress, and then one should increase the benefits and profits, and finally these profits and benefits should go to the larger masses also. So if there is poverty, that poverty is to be alleviated, and poverty can be alleviated in two ways. One, that you help the poor, and the second is you create conditions of production, conditions of work, because of which more people work, and through work they are able to take care of their poverty. So utilitarians on one side and traditionalists on the other, these people were present in the British bureaucracy, and they may have contacted certain friends in India, certain supporters in India, and telling them, that they would have told them that one way to progress for India was to bring in more and more of trade and commerce, more and more of industry, more and more of factories, etc., so that India turned from the old production ways to the new ways of entrepreneurship. So this also came. So it was not merely cultural, it wasn't merely religious, it wasn't merely philosophical. The trend also had its own economic and trade related forms. And these things started happening in a slightly bigger way in the early 19th century, because of which these changes became more and more visible. English was seen then as a modernizing force, and naturally the colleges and other educational institutions set up in the 19th century, notably Hindu college, were centers of radical and progressive thought. Now, the third point that one can make is regarding the use of language. So far, the language in India was always for the formal purposes either Persian or Sanskrit, and for the common functioning it was the local dialects. And people didn't know English. There were no avenues for learning English. There were no schools and colleges at that time till the 18th century, and English was spoken only by the Britishers who were here, and they could not communicate with the local audiences this way. They had to learn Indian languages, which they did, but then English was nowhere to be seen in the social life of the country. And now with the utilitarians and the British bureaucracy occurred the idea that English should be brought in, because English is not merely a medium of instruction, medium of talking, etc. English also, as also is said by Mohan Ramnan, is an ideology. So bring in English, introduce English education, open colleges, make a curriculum, write textbooks, develop Indian languages vis-a-vis English, and that way you modernize the medium through which ideas can be communicated to the people. So language that way becomes a very important factor in the development of Indian thought and society in the early 19th century, and English is thought to be is brought in as that kind of a medium through which new ideas, modern ideas would be expressed. Now, of course, before I begin, I'd want once again I would take help from Uroshi whether language can play such a role in the modernization of a society, and whether language, whether old ideas also cannot be expressed through language, and the society can be kept under check.
Sir, I would like to place an idea before you that instead of saying that English is a language that would promote radical ideas and progressive thought, why could not, of course this could also be done in the same language, but the fact that the modernists wanted to bring about something new, something modern, and their belief was that through English there would be more progress, hence English was introduced. And also, like you mentioned, sir, there was the only official languages were either Hindi or Persian, and so for English to be introduced at the level of college would have to be a very introductory English, teaching English to the students, and that perhaps would take really long for any kind of radical ideas to develop within the same language. So my idea is that Hindi at that time would be more useful as an instrument of propagating radical ideas than English.
Well, there is a point in what you say, and a kind of Hindi had emerged in the 16th century onwards. We have talked about bhakti poets, those who were using Hindi, and they were criticizing the customs and rituals at that point of time. But that process, had ended by the end of the 17th century, and bhakti poets had gone into the limbo. Now nobody would care about bhakti poets and their ideas, and in the 18th century India was not the same kind of peaceful country that it was earlier, and secondly the texts in Hindi were not available, texts in Urdu were not available, the texts in Indian languages were not available, because not much work was done in the 17th century with respect to science and technology. Whereas in English and in other European languages, new texts had emerged, new kind of literature had emerged. Secondly, we were not technologically advanced enough to print books, and we didn't have schools and colleges which were the centers of study. So if we stuck to the Indian dialects, and if we stuck to Sanskrit or Persian, where would you get the texts? And for getting the text, one would have to look up to the West, and Western text could be translated into Sanskrit or Persian, but the Sanskrit, Persian also were confined to the upper crust. So ordinary people will not, take advantage of the Western text. So perhaps the idea was to make people learn English here, and when they learn English, then in the process of learning, they should take help from the English texts also.
Right.
And luckily for India, at the time when English was introduced in England, the most popular literary movement was the Romantic movement.
Right.
So people straight away started with the contemporary writing, which was Romantic poets, and these Romantic poets are very inspiring. And young people in India at that point of time, they took fancy to English language, not merely because English language was the language of the powerful people in India, but because the literature available in the English language was very inspiring. So if you had to read Wordsworth, if you had to read Keats, if you had to read Shelley and etc., then people were filled with fervor. And it was not because of English; it was because of the ideas. In fact, this became clear to the Britishers also towards the middle of the 19th century, that English romantics were sowing seeds of distrust and sowing seeds of rebellion in the hearts of the people, and therefore that should be somewhat discouraged. So it was a double-edged weapon, and I think it's right to say that English is not merely a language in that case; it's also an ideology. And English was a very dynamic language in the 19th century. Lots of experiments were happening at the level of word usage. In fact, a kind of a campaign was started by Wordsworth himself in 1798 through his famous preface, where he said that he will from now onwards use the language of the common masses. So in fact, English as a language was emphasizing the usage by the common masses. And it's not the same 18th century English which talks about manners. It's the new 19th century English which is talking in the idiom of the common masses. So when masses come into the picture, then English becomes a different kind of a language. So it's a language plus it's also an ideology. So this is the point I was making.
Thank you for explaining, sir. And sir, as you said, it is a beginning of a process in the 19th century. So this idea of learning English and seeing it as an ideology was also a beginning that would allow other people to also follow and also learn from that, so that at least an initiation has been made. And sir, I also wanted to ask you, considering that we've talked about a Bhadralok, a specific set of people who were ushering in these modern ideas, were they getting their education of the English language from within India, or were they going abroad for their further studies?
There were, I don't think, as many centers of learning in England at that point of time that people would go from here and learn English there. And in England also, schools and colleges were not as many. So it was just to create facilities of learning language here, opening colleges here, and those colleges would be available, of course, to the Bhadralok and to the elites. And there will be a problem with the elites in India whether they should send their children to learn, Sanskrit, Persian, or English. So particularly in the eastern part of India, some Bhadralok, who had this kind of enlightenment to like, these people thought that perhaps learning English at that point of time will take the children of their families forward.
Right.
So it became English. And the first colleges, and the first Hindu college was the first college to be opened, and this had the support of the Indian elites and of the English elites here, of the English bureaucracy here. So together they formed some kind of a group. They opened the college. They made a constitution. They started thinking of books, etc. They made appointments of people here, and classes were held. And very soon Hindu college would become one of the finest institutions of learning in the country.
Right.
And this happens in the second decade of the 19th century, 1816, 1850, that's the time around which Hindu college comes into being in Calcutta at that point of time. So that's how, then I come to the modernizing force, and naturally colleges and other educational institutions being set up in the 19th century, notably Hindu college. And then, there is a young man called Henry de Rosio, who is taken to teach English in Hindu college, and he has learned his English from another institution which was there in the early 19th century. He was a young man. He would be hardly 20 or so when he joined the Hindu college. In fact, I would like to give some specific ideas about Derozio, because Derozio as a symbol, Derozio as a person, who will be projecting the idea of modernity, projecting the idea of rationality, requires some special mention with respect to his biographical details. So I have his details with me, and I would start this particular point with introduction of Derozio as one of the people through whom English education, modern ideas, modern approach, a kind of Renaissance value system was established. So for instance, he is a Eurasian of Portuguese origin. He is born in India from Portuguese and Indian parents, so he is a Eurasian. It's a combination of Europe and Asia, and his name is Henry Louis Vivian Derozio. He is born in 1809, and in 1931 he dies, which means he lives only for 22 years. Educated at Drummond's Academy, where a dour Scotsman, an exile and notorious freethinker. Notorious because people didn't like him at that time. British regime had to be very conventional and very traditional, but then this person was a kind of freethinker. He was a person who would allow discussion, who would allow difference of opinion, and who would like to take new issues and give you a fresh kind of interpretation to it. He initiated Derozio into reading widely in literature and philosophy, and this person, this Scotsman, he would teach Derozio not merely philosophy but also information about French Revolution and Robert Burns. Robert Burns is a Scottish poet and a person who was a nationalist, and if there is Scottish nationalism that will be ranged against English oppression, therefore Burns also would become a voice of protest and rebellion. And the Scottish gentleman and a free thinker, he introduced Derozio not merely to language, English language, but also to new ideas about French Revolution. And friends, those who have earlier thought of combining French Revolution with Romantic movement in India, they would realize that when French Revolution, which is quite new at the time Derozio learned it. Derozio would have been in school around 1820 or so. Then French Revolution would be just 25 or 27 years old, and then this idea was in the air in England, and this idea also reached India. So which means that it is not merely language, it is also the idea of French Revolution that is introduced to a young man in India who has learnt English and who can enjoy poetry now, and he will adopt this idea and try to apply it to the Indian conditions. And then this person also reads Robert Burns. The brilliance of his teaching as well as his unorthodox teaching methods have made Derozio something of a legend in the annals of Hindu college. This person, Derozio, was one of the finest products of Hindu college, because there he started talking and discussing difficult issues, the issues which became popular among the young people, and finally he was appointed in 1826 at the age of 19. At the age of 17, he was appointed in Hindu college, and in 1831, when he was compelled to resign. So for 5 years, from 26 to 31, he's allowed to be there in Hindu college, and then he's compelled to resign. Why is he compelled to resign is the question. A young man who is interacting with students, a young man who is telling them about French Revolution, about the idea of equality, fraternity, and liberty. This person is not imposing his views. He's merely sharing his perspective, and he's teaching literature, and he's discussing not merely in the classroom but also outside the classroom. So this person, why is he expelled? Why is he compelled to resign? And then there are a few questions that are asked. One is, did his excursion into literature, journey into literature, philosophy and free thought, with his tribe of Ben? He had a tribe. Tribe means, he had a group of people around him. He must have 10, 12 or 20 people who all the time would meet and discuss things with him. So they were called the tribe. Actually, the word comes from Ben Jonson. Ben Jonson, had a group of people in the 16th and early 17th century. And this group of people, admirers and supporters, this was called the tribe of Ben. So that kind of a tribe of Ben was there also in the case of De Rosio. And this tribe heralded an Indian Renaissance. Or was it just a flash in the pan? Now this is a good question. There is just a young man. He has a group of some people who sit with him and discuss with him new ideas in the early 19th century. And this is to bring in what is called the Renaissance in India. So now the question is asked, is it just a flash in the pan? Is it just a minor incident? Or is it something big? Now that question, viewers, you have to ask. I have to ask from myself whether such a small incident as a teacher in a college, studying himself the Romantic poets and others, French Revolution, etc., sharing that perspective with his students, so that finally the people sit up and they say, what is happening in this college? And he's asked to resign. He's thrown out of job. So is this the beginning of Renaissance in India, or is it just a small thing? Now this is a difficult question to raise, because one doesn't think. What do you say? Is it a small thing, or is it a really big, momentous kind of a thing? That a movement begins with him. What do you say?
Sir, I think it's a big thing that he was part of a set of people, and he associated with himself, and that to those he talked about the French Revolution, like you mentioned, the idea of liberty, equality, fraternity, and perhaps he was not appreciated by a set of people that had to have him removed from his position.
This is one, and you can also, Roshi, you can expand it to the larger question. For instance, why is it that a person of this kind emerges? It can't emerge just out of nowhere. It's not a vacuum that is happening. East India Company has been active for quite some time. There has been disgust, dismay, disenchantment with lots of things in the Indian population. Now they don't know how to express it. Who will express it? And suddenly a kind of eruption occurs. That eruption occurs in the form of the making of a college, that college having a student, that student reading literature, and then finally a group emerges. And this group will last. The person will die, the central figure will die, but then his admirers, etc., they will carry the movement forward. So you are right in saying, that it's a big event. It's not a small event, and it's a kind of a spark. But this spark finally will start the fire. So the fire will happen, let's say, in the next 20, 30 years or 40 years. But then the spark is there right in the beginning itself, in the form of some people who have formed a group and who would like to pursue the ideas of liberty, change, and revolution. So this is what has occurred in and it will happen through a language which is not India's own language.
Right.
So one has to accept this fact. And then the next question, which is more important?
Just to interrupt you, sir, but I just wanted to ask you, then he may of course have been supported by the British rulers and also the intelligentsia, the Bhadralok. Would he have been in their favor? They would have supported him, that is my question. That his ideas would not have met with the resistance from their side, but
like in England, where there were traditionalists and there were utilitarians, in India also there were people who were modernists and there were those who wanted to go back to the past and reinterpret it.
Right.
So this kind of a dichotomy was here also.
Was there.
And that's why some people would not allow Raja Ram Mohan Rai, for instance, to be at the center, because he was a kind of a Occidentalist. He was a kind of a modern person. And there were Orientals here, and they were trying to understand even the Indian classics. And there was a trend in India at that time, viewers, when people had started going back to the Vedas. They would not go to the customs and other things, and they were modernizing themselves. But then they said, why learn from English? Why learn from the French Revolution? Why not learn from our own ancient texts, like the Vedas? In fact, I'll take up this question now, that in India at that point of time, a new society also was formed. And this is precisely what you are hinting at, that even among the Bhadralok, there may have been a section which wanted to transform itself as a kind of parallel development to the English hegemony. And for this reason, these people had their own ways. So there was a formation in the eastern part of the country, in Bengal, called Brahmo Samaj. So Brahmo Samaj was a reform movement. It had Brahmins in it, but those Brahmins were enlightened Brahmins, and those who would not go back to the old customs, etc., but they would like to understand, interpret the old texts, and they would put a new meaning into it. So they didn't call themselves Brahmans, but Brahmo, and Brahmo means perhaps the going to the beginning of Indian civilization. And the Vedas are the most ancient texts. So let's go back to them and then learn from there and make them popular and transform our society, rid it of all the customs and rituals that it is bound by. So Brahmo Samaj became a movement, and it started its own educational campaigns. And well, viewers, you know that Brahmo Samaj had in its fold Maharshi Devendranath Tagore, that is Rabindranath Tagore's grandfather. And he was not a traditionalist. He was a Brahmo, but then he swore more by the ancient Indian texts than by other things. And once this Brahmo Samaj had come into being, it became one of the most popular movements, cultural movements in India, and it goes up to the point where it is joined by great people like Vivekananda and Sri Aurobindo. Till Brahmo Samaj goes into that. And all these people, this entire strain of influence, this symbolizes the emphasis on the Indian texts, and there is a kind of a reform that is to be all the time pursued. But then there is the other trend, which is started by Derozio, and that trend also coincides with it. So there are people who support English, there are others who learn English, don't support it that much, and also refer to the Indian classics, etc. So after thinking of the contribution of Derozio, I take up this Brahmo Samaj in to suggest that very soon the modern ideas took the society in the direction where old texts of India were reinterpreted, and unacceptable things were taken out of them, and reform occurred. For instance, Brahmo Samaj would believe in educating the ordinary Indians. Brahmo Samaj would give a kind of reform, bring in reform in the way women were treated. There'll be I'll just read out from here. Ram Mohan Roy established the Brahmo Samaj in the Hindu month of Bhadra in 1828 in Chitpada Road. He had till then been attending worship at the Unitarian prayer meeting, at which his friend Adam officiated. So there were people who were interacting with the Britishers also. Roy and his friends increasingly felt the need for a place where they might meet and worship God in their own way. So God was there, but this God was not the ritualistic God, but a matter of interpretation, and you believed in God, and you felt inspired by the figure of God. That triggered off the establishment of the Samaj. Service was held every Saturday evening, and the attempt was to show that Roy's Brahmism was Hinduism in a more refined form. So in a way, Hinduism also was reasserting itself through Brahmo Samaj in a new way, in a refined form, and that is to be taken note of in the 19th century. And this is also a kind of a renaissance, in the sense that things now are subjected to interpretation and critical scrutiny. The Brahmos were rooted in Bengal, but their influence spread far and wide, etc. And I already discussed this point. And Brahmo Samaj is the first movement in India, first reform movement in India, and it appeals to the reason of people, and finally it gives rise to movements elsewhere. For instance, there's a movement in North India, and it started by Swami Dayananda Saraswati, and it's called Arya Samaj movement. This happens as inspired by the Brahmo Samaj activities in the eastern part of the country. And very soon you can see that the reform movements will link up with the politics of the country towards the end of the 19th century. So things start from the beginning of the 19th century, then comes Brahmo Samaj, then comes Arya Samaj, and then comes also reform movements in Maharashtra, etc. And finally, Swami Dayananda Saraswati and Gandhiji, they ideologically join each other. For instance, Gandhi is very political, Swami Dayananda Saraswati is very social, very reformist kind of a person, and they start talking in the same language. So in a way, if one looks at the period from 1810 onwards up to 1860 or 70, then one realizes, and later, then one realizes that in a span of 70, 80 years, India gets completely transformed into a society which swears by modernity, swears by rationality, swears by criticism, tolerance, discussion and debate, and it's not the same old society where dictates came from above, and the people at the lower rung would merely obey the dictates. So some similarities between Gandhi and Dayananda Saraswati, they really draw our attention and are remarkable. Dayananda rejected caste at birth as birth originated, but conceded that it was perhaps a rational division of society. This is what Gandhi thought, that caste system should not be accepted. But then he said that some kind of a virtual class orientation is there in the caste system itself, which is what Swami Dayananda Saraswati also had said. He had no use for untouchability. So Arya Samaj didn't believe in untouchability, and Gandhiji, of course, was totally against it. And because it had no Vedic sanction, caste was determined by one's virtues, one's truthfulness, self-sacrifice and cleanliness. One went up and down the scale insofar as there were adherence to virtue. This was the original idea about division in society, that one could go from the lower to the higher, or one could come down from the higher to the lower, depending on one's actions, depending on one's practices. So there was no strict adherence to caste, where if one was born in it, then one had to remain all the time in it. Like Gandhiji, Swami Dayananda Saraswati rejected untouchability, but not caste, which Gandhiji also saw as a division of labor. Okay. Dayanand was in favor of widow marriage, which is a very big thing in the 19th century. One knows, that in the early part of the 19th century, burning of widows and sati and all these things, they were rampant, and these people had to really take cudgels against them and finish it off with great effort. Both advocated equal rights for women. This is once again remarkable. It may not have happened even in the 20th century at the grassroots level, but in the 19th century, equality of women was asserted by these reform movements, and it is this that brings in modernity in the genuine sense of the term. So Dayanand was in favor of widow marriage, and probably he was the first to use terms like Swaraj and Swadeshi. This is significant. Suddenly from the reform movement emerges a kind of vocabulary which is political in nature. So initially you talk about widow remarriage, you talk about the unacceptable nature, the unacceptability of widow burning, etc. And on one day you start talking about your own rule, Swaraj or self-rule. Self-rule means that you will not be ruled by the Britishers, who have now turned India into a full-fledged formal colony from 1858 onwards. So Swaraj and Swadeshi, Saraswati was using, and Gandhiji, of course, fought for it for his life. And in a way, Indian nationalism came into being towards the end of the 19th century. Then, let's look at the 2 or 3 different reform movements together. The Brahmos, the Brahmo Samaj, the Prarthana Samajis, these are the Maharashtrians, and the Arya Samajis, these are in the north, may be seen as dominant elements in the formulation of India's nationalist discourse. These 3 things actually move towards making India a kind of a nation. That nation which will not be oppressed by another nation from outside, by an alien power. And therefore, a kind of nationalist discourse that the whole country is bound into a unified thing, and that unified thing is the Indian nature of the whole country being, getting the name India. The culmination of these trends, of course, was in the founding of Indian National Congress in 1885. So 1885 happens 75 years after 1810, when the spark started flying there. It began as a polite body of liberal public men. It is called liberal public men, but this word liberal is slightly more suggestive than it appears to be on the surface, because these liberal public men actually believed in a kind of liberty, in a kind of tolerance, in a kind of mutuality. And if you tolerate, if you believe in mutuality, then very soon 100 people, 1,000 people, or 1 million people come together, because then you start tolerating one another, you start interacting with one another, and with that unity is established. Slowly, at the turn of the century, with the partition of Bengal in 1905, Congress began showing disaffection to the crown and asking for complete independence. Initially, it's a polite group in 1885. It's headed by Britisher, A.O. Hume. But in 15-20 years, Congress becomes a party that wants complete independence. So how come that in a span of 80-90 years, the century turns completely against the Britishers, who started modernity, who started English education, who introduced directly or indirectly the ideas of liberty, equality, etc. But then towards the end, the country unites itself in a certain process and then stands up against the Britishers. So this is what is finally the outcome of the Renaissance in the 19th century, because this kind of a feeling that you will not be ruled by an alien power, you will be your own master, and that you will believe in some kind of equality. This is a value system that India attained through a large number of struggles, hardly fought over a period of 80-90 years, and this was an upheaval which initially was starting with young people in Bengal. In fact, the group of young people was called Young Bengal. So Young Bengal movement, in the early 19th century, with these different movements which are social in nature, finally turning political. And then there is a political party also that they get in the form of Indian National Congress. And well, as the next century opens, in 1905 there is a kind of a division in West Bengal. After that, the country is not the same. Now, I'll just take up one or two issues now and then finish this discussion.
Sir, could I interrupt you for a certain question? Very shortly, sir, you said that it was a body of liberal public men who actually swore allegiance to the British Crown, and there were these people who believed in liberty, equality, tolerance, and you mentioned mutuality, that they wanted to bring a large group of people together instead of protesting. Were these the people who ushered in the modern ideas? Could we say that these liberal public men were the Bhadralok or the people from Brahmo Samaj or the Arya Samajists? Can we say it was these people, or another set of people, or perhaps a larger group of people involved in this practice who were actually became loyal to the British Crown? And then you mentioned that after say 80-90 years, and then they stood against the Britishers.
This is the crux actually, because unless the people above, people who are intellectuals, people who are influential, people whose words carry weight, if they are talking only among themselves at the level of club membership, then nothing happens. They have to take up ideas, which ideas are popular, which ideas appeal to the masses, and then there is a corresponding movement at the level of the masses also. When these things combine, only then this kind of an upheaval occurs. So Renaissance has this peculiar quality. Renaissance works generally at the level of values, and if the values of equality, if the values of justice, etc., they reach the masses, And the people, the upper class people, the privileged people, they take courage in both their hands. They leave their class origins and they go and join with the masses, and struggles begin, and social evils are fought the way Sati Pratha and Thagi etc. were fought. Then of course the country stands up in some kind of a unified form. So that's what seems to have happened. And finally, I have not touched upon the idea of 1857 rebellion. This was a great movement in its own way, and this was economic in nature, political in nature, and maybe the different social movements, they converged on this kind of a thing, and the whole thing became political. So 19th century that way is a very complex kind of a phenomena, and in that phenomena one can only identify some of the points and discuss them at some length, but then more work is still to be done, and your question cannot be easily answered whether it was just the people at the level above who succeeded in doing so, or whether the lower masses also had a role to play. This is in fact the question that should be discussed more and more today, and more study is required. Now I was with great interest I was watching the celebration of 1857, when it was 100 years, when it was 125 years, and I realized that the 125 years the celebration was much bigger than the 100-year celebration of 1857. And the reason was that in 1957, when 100 years were completed, people didn't know about it. They still were discussing whether it was a rebellion, it was a mutiny, or it was the first war of independence.
Right.
But when it came to 125 years, in the I think 80s or so, and 150 years now, I think, in 2007 it was 150 years. That also was celebrated. Then the whole country, in the meantime, all the scholars etc. had done good work, and then a lot of material is coming up now. And the other point that you are making with respect to the writers, the ordinary people, writers are read by the ordinary masses. So one should also study the impact of the 19th century Renaissance on the writing in India, and not merely in English. Right. English writers were there, but there were Hindi writers, there were Urdu writers. In fact, Hindi and Urdu for some time remained merged. There are writers who write in very simple Urdu, which is kind of Hindi. There are Hindi writers who write in very simple spoken language, which is not Sanskritized at all. Premchand, for instance, shifts from one language to another. He starts writing in Urdu, and then he shifts to English, to Hindi. So that way things continue. And now we know more about the 19th century and its and the reasons why it finally merges with the national movement. So all these things are quite important and very inspiring for us, and I think a large number of issues still remain to be studied further by the fellow scholars today, and this thing will continue for many more years.
Absolutely.
So this is what it is. So I think we leave here in the middle, and this question has to continue. What kind of renaissance it was, in what directions it went, how finally it crystallized into a kind of unified India fighting against the oppressors, and how the same movement has to go forward in order to establish real equality, real justice.
Right. Thank you so much, sir, for also concluding for us. And friends, with this we bring our lecture to a close, but we have more to follow in the series, which shall be coming very soon in the next few days. So keep watching out for that. And with this we thank sir. Thank you so much, sir, for being associated with us.
Thank you.
And thank you, friends, for watching. Have a great day.